The paper smelled like wax crayon and something older, something pressed and faintly sour, the way a drawing looks when a child has gone over the same lines so many times the page has started to thin. 53 of them. That was the number the social worker counted when she spread them across the folding table in the county intake room on a Tuesday morning in late October, and each one showed the same squat house, the same black rectangle of door, the same 2 windows like unblinking eyes. And in the lower right corner of every single sheet, drawn in brown crayon with the kind of patient, insistent repetition that belongs only to children and to people who have stopped hoping anyone will listen, a little girl standing alone in front of it. The social worker expected the drawings to explain themselves. She expected someone to come forward, some adult in the child's life who could account for where the house was and why the child kept returning to it in her mind. What nobody expected was who came instead, and what they brought, and what it cost to make the little girl stop drawing that house and start drawing something else. That is the part nobody in that building was ready for. The morning it began was cold in the way that only the high desert can be cold, which is to say completely, without negotiation, the kind of cold that gets into the seams of a leather jacket and stays there through the first 40 miles. The sun had been up for less than an hour above the scrub plateau north of Ash Creek, Arizona, and it was coming in flat and pale from the east, the light the color of old bone, throwing long shadows from the juniper stands across a county road that had not been repaved in 11 years. The frost on the asphalt caught the light and made the road look like something valuable. It was not. Corbin Rask pulled his bike to the side of that road at 6:49 in the morning and cut the engine. He was 51 years old, 6 feet and 2 inches of him, broad through the chest and heavy in the hands the way a man gets when he has been using them for hard things since he was 16. His beard was iron gray and untrimmed, reaching his collar. His face was not a face that made strangers comfortable. There was a scar running from the outside corner of his left eye to his jaw. Not a dramatic scar, but a settled one, long domesticated, the kind of mark a face absorbs over decades until it seems like it grew there. He wore the Ash Creek Rider's cut, black leather, the chapter patch showing the high desert mesa and the hawk, and he had worn it for 31 years. He was the last of the founding members still riding. The president's patch on his chest had been his for 19 of those years, and in all of those years, on every road, in every weather, he had not stopped for anything small. He stopped now because there was a child sitting in the bar ditch at the side of the road. She was 7 years old, though he would not know that for another hour. She was wearing a pink jacket that had been washed too many times, faded at the elbows to the color of old gum, and she had a backpack on that was nearly as wide as her shoulders. She was sitting with her knees pulled up and both arms wrapped around something flat and rectangular pressed against her chest, and she was not crying, which was the first thing that struck him as wrong. She was just sitting there, looking at the road in front of her with the particular stillness of a child who has learned that moving draws attention of the wrong kind. The cold was 28 degrees. She had been there long enough for the frost on the gravel around her to have melted in a small radius from her body heat and refrozen at the edges. Corbin got off the bike. He did not rush. He had learned, a long time ago, the specific damage that rushing does, and he moved toward her the way he moved through everything now, with his hands visible and his pace deliberate. He crouched down about 4 feet away from her, which put his eyes near her level, and he did not speak immediately. He looked at the road the same direction she was looking, as if they had both stopped here for the same reason and were simply sharing the view. After a while, she looked at him. He looked back. "You waiting for somebody?" She considered the question with the seriousness it apparently deserved. "I'm waiting for someone to find my house," she said. He did not ask what that meant, not yet. He looked at the flat thing she was holding against her chest, at the edges of paper visible above and below her arms, and he looked at her boots, which were the wrong boots for the cold canvas sneakers with the left sole pulling away from the upper. He unzipped his jacket. She watched him do it with no alarm and no particular interest. He shrugged it off and held it out toward her. She looked at it. "It's real heavy," she said. "It'll keep you warm," he said. She thought about that. Then she let him drape it around her shoulders, and it swallowed her completely, pooling on the gravel around her small feet, and she pulled it close with one arm and went back to holding the papers with the other. He sat down on the ground next to her. The cold of the frost came through his jeans and he did not move. He would find out what she was waiting for. He would do it at whatever speed she needed. He had nowhere more important to be, and that was the truth. And somehow children always knew when the truth was what they were being given. Her name was Della Birch. She told him this after a few minutes, in the same flat, declarative voice she used for everything, the voice of a child who has been asked to account for herself often enough that the explaining has become rote. Della Birch, 7 years old, and she had been in foster care for 4 months, and before that she had been in a house that she drew. She did not say any of this as complaint. She said it as inventory, the same way you might list what was in a bag before you handed it to someone. The papers pressed against her chest were her drawings of the house, she said, because she needed someone to see what it looked like so they could find it, because her brother was still there. That was the whole thing. That was everything. She had gathered up her drawings and walked out of the foster home before first light and come to the road, because the road went somewhere and someone on it would help. She had been waiting for 1 hour and 40 minutes in 28-degree cold. Corbin Rask sat with that for a moment. The flat, pale morning light was beginning to warm slightly, moving from bone white toward something closer to yellow, and the frost was releasing on the road ahead in thin wisps of vapor. He looked at the drawings she finally offered to show him, pulling them out from under his jacket with careful hands. 53 sheets of paper, not all of them with him there on the roadside, but enough. The house was always the same, squat and low, with a concrete block wall on one side that she always colored gray, and a truck parked at an angle in the dirt yard, colored brown. And in the window on the left, every single time, a small figure no bigger than a thumbprint. That was her brother. His name was Marcus, and he was 9 years old, and he had not come with her to the foster placement because the agency said there was no room. He had gone somewhere else. She did not know where. She only knew the house. She had never stopped knowing the house. Corbin looked at the drawing in his hand for a long time. He looked at the small figure in the window. He turned the paper over as if there might be something written on the back, and there was nothing, just the faint ghost of the crayon lines pressing through. He set it carefully on top of the stack, and he handed the stack back to Della, and he stood up. He took his phone out of his pocket. It was 3 minutes past 7 in the morning. He made a call. It rang twice, and a man's voice came on, gritty with sleep, saying, "Yeah, I need you at the highway junction on County 14, Corbin said. "Now." The man did not ask why. That was the thing about 31 years. You stopped needing to know why before you moved. His name was Terrence Odell, but everyone in the Ash Creek Riders called him Patch, for reasons that had calcified into legend over 2 decades, and he was the club's road captain and had been for 8 years. He arrived 12 minutes later on a dark blue bike with salt from the winter roads still in the wheel wells, and he pulled up behind Corbin's machine and got off without cutting the engine at first, just standing there looking at the two of them on the gravel shoulder, the big man in a flannel shirt in the cold and the small girl in the enormous leather jacket with the club patch on the back. Patch cut the engine. He came over. He crouched down to Della's level the way Corbin had, not because Corbin had taught him to do it, but because some instincts transfer without words through years of proximity. "Morning," he said. "Morning," Della said. She had the drawings held against her chest again. Patch looked at Corbin over her head. Corbin said nothing. Patch looked back at the girl. "You draw those?" She nodded. He said, "Can I see?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she handed him the top one. He took it in both hands, holding it the way you hold something you understand is important. And he looked at the house and the truck and the small figure in the window, and he looked at it for a long time. When he handed it back, he said, "We're going to find it." She studied him the way children study faces to determine if the adults attached to them are lying. She must have decided he was not, because she nodded again, once, and pulled the drawing back into the stack. The call went out before 8. That was how it worked with the Ash Creek Riders. There was no long deliberation, no committee, no vote taken over days. Corbin made 3 more calls from the roadside, and Patch made 6, and within 90 minutes the phones had run through the entire roster and the club's mutual aid network, which stretched from the Arizona high desert into New Mexico and up into southern Utah. And the word was simple. There is a child. There is a missing boy. There is a house somewhere, and we have drawings of it. Come. There were 114 members of the Ash Creek Riders in active standing. When Corbin rode Della to the County Department of Child Safety office in Flagstaff at 9 that morning, he had 37 of them behind him, and more were on their way. The DCS office on Birch Avenue in Flagstaff was a low brick building with a parking lot that had never been designed to hold 37 motorcycles, and by 10:15 it was holding 42. A woman named Sandra Yee was the case coordinator assigned to Della Birch's file, and she came out into the parking lot at 10:20 with the particular expression of a person whose morning had gone sideways in a direction no workflow chart had prepared her for. She was 43 years old, methodical in the way of someone who had come to her profession through belief and stayed in it through stubbornness, and she stood on the sidewalk outside the office door and looked at the rows of bikes and the men and women standing beside them, and she pressed her clipboard against her chest, which was almost exactly what Della did with her drawings, and she said, "I need to understand what is happening here." Corbin stepped forward. He said, "There's a 9-year-old boy. His name is Marcus Birch. He's in a placement somewhere, and his sister walked out of her foster home this morning in 28-degree cold and sat by the side of a highway to get someone to look for him." Sandra Yee looked at him. Then she looked at the child standing just to his left, swimming in his jacket, the stack of drawings held flat against her small chest. Sandra Yee looked back at Corbin. She said, "Come inside." The room they sat in was the kind of room that government buildings produce in bulk, fluorescent lit and beige walled, with a table that wobbled on one leg and chairs that had been recovered from somewhere. Della sat in one of the chairs, and Corbin sat next to her, and Sandra Yee sat across and began pulling up case files on a computer that sounded like it was deciding whether to continue cooperating. Patch stood near the door. The drawings were on the table between them, and Sandra had looked at each one carefully, in sequence, without speaking, which was the right way to do it. When she finished, she stacked them neatly and pushed them back toward Della. "You drew all of these," she said. It was not a question. Della said yes. Sandra said, "Can you tell me about Marcus?" Della's face did not change. She said, "He has asthma. He needs his inhaler at night. He was at that house before me, and I don't know if they moved him somewhere else or if he's still there." She said this in the same inventory voice. Just the facts, arranged in order of importance. Sandra Yee wrote something on her notepad and underlined it twice. There was a problem, and the problem was jurisdictional, and Sandra Yee explained it to Corbin in the hallway while Patch stayed with Della. The placement records for Marcus Birch had been entered under a different case number by a different worker in a different county office, which meant Sandra did not have immediate access to them, and the system that was supposed to link sibling cases across county lines was, she said with the specific flatness of someone who has complained about this before, not currently functioning correctly. It would require a formal information request to the county of record, which was Yavapai County, and the standard processing time on such a request was 3 to 5 business days. Corbin looked at her. He said, "He's 9 years old and he has asthma, and it's October. Sandra Yee met his eyes without blinking. She said, "I know that." He believed her. He could see it in her jaw, in the small, tight set of her mouth, the way her pen was clicking against her thigh without her seeming to notice. She was not indifferent. She was caught in something designed to grind slowly, and it ground on people like her first. He said, "What can we do that doesn't take 3 to 5 days?" She looked down at her notepad. She said, "You can let me make some calls." He let her make some calls. He went back into the beige room with Della and Patch and another writer who had come in, a woman named Faye Durrell who had been in the club for 11 years and who brought coffee from somewhere and set it on the table without making a ceremony of it, and the four of them sat in that room together while Sandra Yee worked her phone in the hallway. Della had her drawings in her lap. After a while she took the top one out and looked at it, and then she looked up at Corbin and said, "Do you think he's cold?" The question landed in Corbin's chest like a stone dropped down a well. He said, "We're going to make sure he's not." She nodded. She looked back at the drawing. She said, "He gets scared at night." She said it as a statement of established fact, not as a plea, and that was what made it unbearable, the absence of pleading in it, the simple, flat reporting of a thing she had been carrying alone for 4 months. Faye Durrell looked at her coffee cup. Patch looked at the door. Corbin looked at the drawing in Della's hands, at the small figure in the left window, brown crayon, no bigger than a thumbprint. He had looked at a drawing like this before, not these drawings. A different one, in a different room, 16 years ago, and he had not been there when it mattered. He was here now. That was the only equation he had left. The call Sandra Yee made that changed the trajectory came at 11:40. She came back into the beige room with her clipboard and her pen, and she said, "I reached the Yavapai County supervisor directly. She's pulling the file manually." She looked at Della. "We're going to have an address before 2 o'clock. Della looked at her. She said, "Is he okay?" Sandra said, "I don't know yet, honey, but we're going to find out." Della put her drawing back on the stack. She lined the edges up carefully, all 53 of them, and she set the stack flat on the table and she put both palms on top of it and she waited. The room was very quiet. Outside in the parking lot, through the single window, the rows of bikes were visible in the pale October light, and there were more of them now than there had been an hour before. By noon, there were 67 bikes in that parking lot and on the street in front of the building. By 12:30, there were 81. Word had reached riders in Prescott and in Williams and in Show Low and in the communities east of Holbrook, and they came the way the Ash Creek riders always came when the call was real, which is to say without spectacle, without noise beyond what the machines themselves made arriving, and they parked and they waited. Sandra Yee looked out the front window of the building at 12:45 and stood there for a moment without saying anything. Then she turned back to her desk and kept working. The address came through at 118. It was a rural route number outside a small town called Mayer, Arizona, which was 41 miles southeast of Prescott, and it matched the drawings in every detail that could be verified from a satellite image on Sandra's computer screen. The concrete block wall on the north side, the dirt yard, the angle of the driveway. Sandra printed the address, and a DCS field investigator named Doug Harmon, who had driven up from his afternoon route to be present and who had been the quietest person in the room all morning, said, "I need to make contact with the placement family before anyone else goes out there. That's procedure." He said it looking at Corbin. Corbin said, "How long does that take?" Doug Harmon said, "I'll make the call right now." He looked at his phone. Then he looked at Corbin again and he said, "You want to ride out anyway?" It was not a question. Corbin said, "I want to be there when you arrive." Doug Harmon looked at him for what felt like a long time. He said, "Stay on the road until I make contact." Corbin said, "Agreed." The column left Flagstaff at 1:37. Not all of them. Some stayed with Della. with Faye and 3 others keeping her company in the DCS office, while Sandra Yee coordinated with the Yavapai placement team. But the riders who went numbered 89, and they rode south on the interstate and then east on State Route 69 toward Mayer, in a column that stretched for nearly a mile. And every driver who pulled aside to let them pass, and then watched the column continue, watched it for longer than they expected, the way you watch something that just keeps being larger than you thought it was. 89 motorcycles on a 2-lane Arizona highway in October, in the flat gold afternoon light, headed toward a house that a 7-year-old girl had been drawing for 4 months. Corbin rode at the front of the column, with Patch behind him, and the road unwinding ahead, in the way roads in the high desert unwind, long and direct, the landscape opening around them, like something that had been waiting to be seen. The cold had lifted slightly with the afternoon, maybe 38 degrees now, and the sky had gone from bone white to a thin, clear blue, the kind of blue that only appears in late October in Arizona, when the summer is genuinely over, and the air has a cleanness to it like something rinsed. He did not think about what they would find. He thought about the column behind him, the sound of it, which he could feel in his chest through the seat of the bike. 89 machines in motion, and he thought about the last time he had felt something this large and this certain, moving in one direction. 16 years. That was how long it had been since the reason he understood this particular kind of cold and this particular kind of waiting. His nephew, Daniel, who had been 8 years old when Corbin's sister dropped out of contact and took the boy with her, and who had been found 6 months later in a county facility in New Mexico, and who Corbin had not been there to find because he had not been the kind of man then who went looking in time. He had told himself the story differently for years, had arranged it in his memory as a thing that happened to him rather than a thing he had failed to prevent. But the truth was simple, and it sat in him the way stones sit at the bottom of water, not moving, not dissolving. He had been 48 days too late. Daniel was all right in the end. That was what everyone told him, and it was true, and it was not the same as having been there. He rode now with the column behind him and the house ahead, and he did not need the reason to be complicated. Della had drawn the same house 53 times because she needed someone to see it. He was going to make sure someone saw it. That was the whole equation. It was not redemption. It was just the next right thing, done at the right speed this time. The Mayer placement home stood at the end of a dirt road off the rural route, and it was exactly the house in the drawings. The concrete block wall on the north face, gray. The dirt yard with a brown truck angled in it, the 2 front windows. Doug Harmon's county vehicle was already there when the column reached the road's end, parked at the gate, and Doug was standing outside it talking on his phone, and he held up one hand when he saw the column approach, the flat palm gesture that means hold. And Corbin stopped his bike and held his right fist up, and the column stopped behind him. 89 machines going quiet in sequence like something being turned off one switch at a time, until the only sound was the wind moving through the dry grass at the road's edge. Doug finished his call. He walked over to Corbin. He said, "The boy is here. He's okay. The placement family has been called and a family specialist is inside." He looked down the road at the column of riders. Then he said, "You can come in. 1 or 2. Corbin said, "Just me." Patch put a hand briefly on Corbin's shoulder as he swung off the bike, which was all that needed to be said. The inside of the house was dim and smelled of propane and dust and something faintly medicinal. A woman named Carla Ashby stood in the kitchen doorway, 40 or so, defensive in the posture of someone who was not certain yet what she was being accused of, and Corbin did not look at her for long. A boy was sitting on the couch in the small front room. He was 9 years old, angular and watchful, with his sister's same quality of stillness, the watchfulness of a child who has learned to be quiet in rooms where the adults are uncertain. He had a blue inhaler on the cushion beside him. He was looking at Corbin with an expression that was not fear exactly. but something adjacent to it, the taut alertness of someone deciding. Corbin sat down on the coffee table across from him, putting himself at the boy's eye level, which was low enough that he had to lean forward. He said, "Marcus." The boy said, "Yeah." Corbin said, "Your sister sent us." The boy's face did not break immediately. It worked itself through several things very quickly, the way a face does when it has been keeping itself composed for a long time, and something finally reaches the latch. Then his jaw moved and his eyes went bright, and he looked down at the inhaler on the cushion and he said, "She's okay?" Corbin said, "She's been waiting for someone to find this house." Marcus looked up. He said, "She drew it." It was not a question. Corbin said, 53 times. Marcus's face finished whatever it had been doing. He said, very quietly, "I knew she would." Doug Harmon spent an hour in that house completing the required documentation, the welfare check notation, the placement review flag, the request for emergency sibling reunification review that Sandra Yee had already initiated from her end in Flagstaff. During that hour, Corbin sat with Marcus in the front room, and Carla Ashby made coffee she did not offer to Corbin and the family specialist, a young woman named Priya Nolan who had driven out from Prescott, worked through her checklist with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew how to make a checklist feel like something other than a checklist. Outside, 88 riders waited on the dirt road in the October afternoon. Some of them got off their bikes. Some of them stood together in small groups, talking in the low voices people use when they are waiting near something that matters. A few of them had brought food in saddlebag containers and they shared it without making any production of the sharing. One of them, a man named Burl Cates, who was 62 and had been riding since before Corbin took his first oath, produced a thermos of coffee from somewhere and it went down the line. Priya Nolan came out first and stood on the porch and looked at the line of riders stretching down the dirt road, and her face went through something that was not quite composure. She said, to no one in particular, "How many are there?" Burl Cates, closest to the porch, said, 89. She nodded. She looked back at the house. She said, "We're going to need to arrange transport." Burl said, "We can do that." She looked at him. He looked back. She said, "He needs to go to Flagstaff." Burl said, "We know the way." The reunification happened in the DCS office on Birch Avenue at 4:47 in the afternoon. Sandra Yee had cleared the beige conference room, and Della was there with Faye Durrell and 2 other riders, and Marcus came through the door with Priya Nolan and a temporary guardian form that was the first step of a process that would take 11 more weeks, but that had started, today, in the right direction. Della stood up from her chair when her brother came through the door. She still had the drawings in her hand. She had been holding them all day. She walked toward him and he walked toward her, and they did not say anything for a long moment, and Della pressed her face against his shoulder, and Marcus put both arms around her, and he was taller than her by nearly a head, this 9-year-old boy who had been waiting for someone to see the house, and he held his sister and the drawings crinkled slightly between them, pressed between their 2 bodies, all 53 of them. Faye Durrell looked at the wall. Sandra Yee set her clipboard down on the table and did not pick it up for a while. In the parking lot outside, 89 motorcycles stood in the last of the October light, which had gone from pale blue to the deep amber gold that the desert makes of late afternoon, and the long shadows of the bikes stretched eastward across the asphalt in thin parallel lines like something written down. Sandra Yee came out to the parking lot at 5:15. She was looking for Corbin, and she found him standing by his bike at the edge of the lot, looking at the street. She said, "I want you to know that what you did today was not nothing." He looked at her. She said, "The sibling placement failure in this case was a systemic error. It should have been caught. It was not. What caught it was a 7-year-old girl and 53 drawings and whatever this was." She gestured at the bikes. "I'm going to make sure the right people see those drawings and understand what almost didn't happen." he said. What happens to them now? She said, there's a relative placement possibility. Father's aunt, outside of Sedona. She's been notified. We're looking at a provisional placement hearing in 3 weeks. She paused. It looks good. He nodded. She said, can I ask you something? He said, go ahead. She said, why did you stop? He looked at the street for a moment. He said, she was in the ditch in 28-degree cold, holding drawings of a house. Sandra looked at him. He said, I stopped because she was there. Sandra Yee looked at the rows of bikes. She said, 89 of you stopped. He said, 89 of us ride. The provisional hearing took place in Yavapai County 3 weeks and 2 days later. The relative placement with the father's aunt, a woman named Greta Fossey, who was 64 and had a house outside Sedona with 2 dogs and a garden and a room with a window that faced east, was approved. Della and Marcus Birch were placed in Greta Fossey's home on the 17th of November, which was a Wednesday with cold, clear weather and a sky the color of good denim. Sandra Yee attended the transfer. Priya Nolan attended. Doug Harmon, who had not been back in contact since the day of the welfare check, sent a card that said simply, keep drawing. Corbin Rask and Patch and Faye Durrell and Burl Cates and 6 other riders from the Ash Creek Riders were there at the house in Sedona when the car pulled up, standing in the driveway in their cuts, not making ceremony of it, just there, the way the club was there for things that mattered. Greta Fossey stood on her porch and watched the riders and then watched the car door open and Della climb out with the backpack and Marcus climb out after her. And Greta Fossey came down the porch steps and opened her arms and both children walked into them without hesitation, the way children walk toward warmth when they have been cold for a long time and they can finally see it and trust it. A week after the placement, Della sent a drawing to the Ash Creek Riders Clubhouse in a standard envelope with a return address written in careful block letters, the way children write things they want to make sure arrive. The drawing showed a house with a garden and a window facing east and 2 dogs in the yard and in front of the house, standing in a row that required considerable artistic license given the scale. A line of motorcycles that went all the way to the edge of the paper. In the lower right corner, where the lone girl had always been before, there were 2 figures standing side by side. The drawing was put in a frame and hung on the wall of the clubhouse above the president's table, where it stayed. The following October, the Ash Creek Riders ran what they called the Della Run, 41 miles from Flagstaff to Mayer and back, a fundraiser for sibling placement advocacy at the state level. 11 riders went the first year, the second year 43. By the 4th year, 112 riders made the run, and Della and Marcus Birch rode the last mile of it on the back of Corbin Rask's bike, one of them behind him, and one in front with his arms around both of them like a wall against the wind. The number raised in that 4th year was $11,040, and it was delivered to the Arizona Foster Sibling Advocacy Fund in a check that Sandra Yee signed and Corbin countersigned, and the memo line read, "For the ones still waiting." Marcus Birch was 18 when he told the story at a DCS symposium in Phoenix, standing at a podium in a room full of social workers and case supervisors and 1 or 2 state legislators, and he told it quietly, the way his sister always told things, with the inventory voice, the facts in order of importance. He said, "My sister drew a house 53 times because she needed someone to see it, and a man on a motorcycle stopped and looked, and he brought 89 more, and they went and found me." He paused. He said, "I had an inhaler and I was not cold." He looked down at his notes. He looked back up. He said, "I just needed someone to go and look." The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when something has been said that does not require addition. Della Birch turned 17 3 weeks after that symposium. She was studying studio art. Her portfolio included landscapes and architectural studies and figure drawings of considerable technical precision, and in the lower right corner of almost every piece, so small you had to look for it, she still drew a house, not the gray house with the black door and the concrete wall. This house had a garden and a window facing east, and 2 dogs in the yard, and a line of motorcycles along the bottom of the frame, patient and permanent, going all the way to the edge. You think you know what a group like that is for when you see them coming. You read the leather and the volume and the size of them, and you file it under things to be wary of, and you move on. But the little girl sitting in the frost at the side of the road in 28-degree cold did not know any of that, had not been taught yet what to be afraid of, and so she held out her drawings to the first person who stopped, and the first person who stopped brought 89 more, and those 89 went out on a cold October highway and did what the institution had not done in 4 months. They looked. The roar of that many engines at full throttle is a sound that gets into your bones and stays. But the sound Marcus Birch still carries, the one he said into the microphone in the quiet Phoenix room, is the sound of 89 engines going quiet in sequence outside the house in Mayer, one by one, each one stopping because the one ahead of it stopped, until the road was still, and the only sound was the wind through dry grass and a door opening.